Let's continue our lecture on the sufficiently general theory of governance. Today we will talk about setting of objectives. Well, everyone should remember this picture. This is the basic formula that shows the ratio of information modules in the process of governance. The essence is simple. The vector of objectives of governance minus the vector of current state of the enclosed system is equal to the vector of error of governance. Well, and as usual, in all formulas, you can move the components from the left side of the equality to the right, and vice versa. Then it turns out, what for one subject is the vector of objectives of governance, for another subject, this may be the vector of error of governance. And then we will enter into a situation of conflicted governance. This possibility must be taken into account when setting objectives. What else is there? There is also such a circumstance that in the majority of cases, when we think about governance, we simply consider a particular process and do not ponder on the fact that the particular process that we want to govern interacts in some way with encompassing processes. And the objective of governance is not so simple as it seems to us. Why not so simple? Well, because the sufficiently general theory of governance has an expanded understanding of the term vector of objectives. That is, when we see on this diagram the list I want, I want, I want, then the question arises, to what do these I wants refer? And these I wants, they can refer in fact to anything. It can be a single point in the space of formal parameters, that is, it may look like this. If the plane of the paper is the space of formal parameters, then this point here is the objective, a single vector in this space of parameters. What dimensionality of the space of parameters? This is an open question. It's a question of concretics. Well, this is the final objective, and the process can be such that the path to the final objective goes through a number of stages. So, this is the first, second, third, the objectives of 3 different stages. And nonetheless, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, all this is collected into one vector of objectives. And from this vector of objectives, you must, in each specific case, single out the objectives of different stages and single them out in such a way that they are mutually consistent, in the sense that the achievement of the objectives of the first stage guarantees the possibility of achieving the objectives of the second stage. The achievement of the objectives of the second stage, in turn, guarantees the possibility of achieving the objectives of the third stage, which are the final objectives of everything else. Here there arises another moment. You see, in the majority of cases, people tend to think in states. So all these objectives here of the first, second, third stages, they are perceived by many people as something frozen, having no movement. And if in relation to the first, second stages, this is more or less acceptable, then the question with the third stage turns out to be not so simple and acceptable, because the objectives of the first and second stages are fragments of a process that can be depicted like this.
изображен так. Вот.
And what about the objectives of the third stage? And the objectives of the third stage, in any case, no matter how you contrive, are not the final state. Even if there is an illusion that this is the final state, the objectives of the third stage are some kind of fragment, some episode in an encompassing process, which is shown here with red lines. This is the encompassing process. And so it turns out that if you ask yourself about setting of objectives, then you must ensure setting of objectives in such a way that the objectives of the final stage of your particular process belong to an encompassing process that has acceptable to you characteristic features. If you are not able to ensure the acceptability of these characteristic features, then, having achieved the objectives, you will encounter various kinds of either side effects or nullification for you of the significance of the already achieved objectives. Well, the most common example that I give on this theme is the objective of the third stage, not to miss the Titanic, which is departing on her maiden voyage, which will be the last. From where can you gain confidence that the objectives of the final stage of your particular process will be acceptable to you? The answer to this question is simple, but it lies outside the logics of everyday thinking. The point is that the sufficiently general theory of governance is not compatible with the atheistic worldview. It assumes that all particular processes, one way or the other, are included in a certain hierarchy, and the top of this hierarchy is the hierarchically highest, all-encompassing governance, which includes all particular processes in a certain order of their mutual nestedness. In a certain order of mutual nestedness. This means that some processes can be completely inside others, like nesting dolls inside nesting dolls that encompass them. Or such systems can arise when nested processes, by some of their fragments, impact the encompassing processes and are, in essence, part of them. This kind of thing happens. This is especially true in all cases of social governance. Well, in this there is also nothing new, because Kluchevsky, characterizing social processes in Russia, expressed such a paradoxical aphorism. In Russia, the center is on the periphery. That is, on the one hand, there is St. Petersburg, and, on the other hand, something can happen in the provinces that will subsequently exert an impact on the life of St. Petersburg as the capital, and on the life of the empire as a state and civilization of many peoples within the borders of one state. Therefore, the question of mutual nestedness of systems, mutual nestedness of processes, is not the easiest question. And in the concretics of life situations, you need to see when the processes turn out to be simply nested particular in encompassing, and when they are intertwined in such a way that, depending on where you are, at what stage of the algorithm, the same process can act as a nested one in some aggregates of other processes, and can act as a hierarchically higher encompassing one in relation to other processes. At the same time, all processes are, in a way, in the stream of the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance, which we call almightiness. Now, if you do not take into account the fact that the particular process that you aspire to govern is really particular and it is an element of an encompassing process, then you can come into conflict with the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance. And it would seem that everything is calculated successfully, and by strength of a random, so-called convergence of circumstances, it will simply collapse, or the result will be somewhat different from what you expected. Moreover, this somewhat different may be completely catastrophic, and may not be completely catastrophic. But if everything is good, and you are in harmony with the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance, then by virtue of the fact that your ideas about the world are limited, there will also be concomitant effects, but they will improve the results that you intended and not devalue it or degrade its quality. Therefore, questions about setting of objectives are really very important questions, which determine everything that follows in the processes of governance. And if you make errors at the stage of setting of objectives, then by doing so, you program some errors, and, accordingly, a drop in the quality of governance at all subsequent stages of the entire function. As a result of setting of objectives, the vector of objectives should arise. Variants are also possible here. You can initiate a process of governance that is almost completely isolated from other processes. In this case, when you initiate this process, you completely build a vector of objectives of governance. But since we live, and in the process of our life, we constantly solve some governorial tasks, the new objectives that we set for ourselves, they somehow fit into the objective vector of objectives that we have followed in life up to this point. So here I said the words, an objective vector of objectives. An objective vector of objectives means work, regardless of the self-evaluations of the subject governor, towards the vector of objectives that the subject will definitely achieve as a result of his governance. That is, the objective vector of objectives may differ from the subjective vector of objectives of one and the same subject. And if the difference between the objective vector of objectives and the subjective vector of objectives of one and the same subject is overcritical, then the implementation of the objective vector of objectives will cause disappointment, since the objectives of the subjective vector of objectives will not be achieved. And this circumstance leads to the question that it's necessary to correctly evaluate your subjective vector of objectives. And in order to evaluate your subjective vector of objectives, you must work, first of all, on your NRAVIOUSNESS, on the culture of personal world perception, on the culture of meaningful comprehension of the world. That is, this is all that relates to the personal psyche. If you don't deal with this, but simply look at different subjects who are trying to govern, perhaps uniqualitative processes, there may be heteroqualitative processes, but in this case it's after all better to look at those who are trying to govern uniqualitative processes, because the whole plurality of subjects claiming to govern or governing such processes will fall into two categories. Those who can achieve the objectives precisely by strength of subjective reasons, because the matrix of possibilities, it is the same for all of them, and other subjects by strength of the same subjective reasons characteristic of each of them will not be able to achieve these objectives. Well, one such brutal example, at least in the 1960s, 1970s, in the American carrier-based aviation, was such a saying: all are equal in front of the ramp, both the lieutenant and the colonel. Behind this saying, there is the process of landing an aircraft on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The technique is such that the aircraft carrier adopts a course against the wind, so that the wind blows along the runway towards the aircraft, and the aircraft descends along the glide path until the tail hook touches the deck, where the hook must catch on the cable of one of the arresting gears. But when an aircraft carrier moves against the wind, there appears a vacuum zone behind its aft end, the same as behind vehicles. And the fact is that when the plane passes this vacuum zone, it sinks down relative to the glide path. And if the aircraft carrier is rocking, there can also be rolling. Then there arises a statistics of aircraft failures, landing below the level of the flight deck, which ends in flight accidents. The aircraft hits the stern of the ship, and the stern part of the runway is covered with an aerodynamic canopy, under which the flight deck lighting lanterns, part of the lanterns, are located. The construction looks like a ramp. And behind this brutal saying, all are equal before the ramp, both the lieutenant and the colonel, there is the subjective conditionality of the result of governance. Therefore, the question of distinguishing between your subjectivism and objectively occurring processes is a very important question for entering into any process of governance. What else is there? And before the objective of the first stage, we have the point of the factual starting position. From this point, we must get to the objectives of the first stage. How can we get there? We can get there by different paths. because the paths can be like this. Here are the first and second paths. And there may be such paths. Here is the third path. But the third path is characterized by the fact that its beginning does not lie at point F. And now, if the matrix of possibilities is such that we can reach the objectives of the first stage only from point F by some paths, and we actually find ourselves not at point F, but at another point, from where the third path begins. From this point, F2, in the matrix of paths, there is no first stage. Then, we will never be able to get from it to the objectives of the first stage, and, accordingly, we may not be able to achieve our final objective, which we would like. Why? Because if we correctly evaluate our position in the space of formal parameters, then if we are at point F, we will go where we need to. But if we think that we are at point F, but in fact we are at point F2, then we will not be able to get where we need to, but we will have the illusion that we will get where we need to. The disappointment will be real. This is what I said. Only really existing processes can be governed. But if we have the illusion of governance, the illusion of the existence of the process, then our disappointment will be quite real. And one of the illusions is the loss of our place in the factual space of parameters, in which we are situated and are trying to build something in life. This is one such illusion that can lead to breakdown of governance. Then the question arises, and after all, what about the setting of objectives? Well, let's say we have compiled a list. I want 1, I want 2, I want 3. We have a list of wishes. Let's say we have a one-stage process. So, the vector of objectives of governance is simply a vector, but not a sequence of vectors, not a branching sequence of vectors. What then? And then it turns out that at the basis of setting of objectives, after all, should in some way be the task of the stability of behavior of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior. The task of the stability of behavior of the object of governance in terms of the predictability of its behavior, it is solved. It is solved in two ways. The first and foremost is intuition. The second and auxiliary is science. It must be understood that science is not superior in relation to intuition. Science, in the form in which it exists, is a kind of meaningful comprehension of everything that is intuitively seen by various researchers throughout the history of humanity when science
Ну,
exists in it.
разными исследователями на протяжении всей истории человечества, когда в ней существует наука. Поэтому, когда мы
Therefore,
пытаемся
when we
решать
try to solve
экономические
governorial
задачи
tasks
исключительно на
exclusively on the
основе
basis of
предметов,
scientific methods of anticipating these or those consequences,
мы можем
we may
потерять
lose some
какие-то
features
особенности, которые
that do
мы
not fit
вносим
into the
в модели,
models
которые
offered to us by
делает наука.
science.
Ну, а если
Well, if we
говорить
talk
о
about the tasks of
задачах
governance in social systems,
управления в социальных системах, то надо понимать,
then we
что
must
жизнь
understand that
человека
the life of a
зависит
person, the life of
от
groups of
этих
people,
социальных
social
групп,
groups,
от
culturally
этого
peculiar
своеобразных
societies,
обществ. Человеческое
humanity as a
население
whole, is
подчинена
subordinated to objective
5
laws that can
закономерностям,
be
которые
attributed to
можно
6
отнести к
groups.
6 группам. Первая группа
The first group
– это
is
общебиосферные
pan-biospheric objective laws
закономерности,
that
которые
regulate the
регулируют
interrelationship of the
взаимоотношения
biosphere of the Earth
биосферы
with the
Земли с
cosmos,
космосом, с
with nature as a
природой,
whole,
а
and
также
also regulate the
регулируют
life of biocenoses in the composition of this
жизнедеятельность
biosphere.
внутри этой биосферы. Вторая группа
The second
закономерностей –
group
это
is
специфические
species-specific objective
биологические
laws that distinguish the biological
которые
species,
отличают
Homo sapiens, from
биологический
all
вид
other
и,
biological
соответственно, от
species.
всех остальных биологических видов. Третья
The
группа
third group
закономерностей
is
– это
socio-cultural objective
социокультурные
laws.
закономерности. Те закономерности, которые
They
определяют
determine the culturally conditioned interconnections of people
культурно-общественные
with each other
взаимосвязи людей
and the
в обществе
prospects for the life of
перспективе
society under the
жизни
power of a particular
общества в
culture, if
структуре
culture is considered
определенной
as an
структурной
informational
системы,
algorithmic system.
алгоритмическую систему. Мы можем построить культуру,
We can build a
которая
culture
изменит
that will
общество
kill
в течение
society
жизни
over the
нескольких
course of the life of several
поколений. Можем
generations,
построить
or we
культуру,
can build a
которая
culture
обеспечит
that will
гармонию
ensure the harmony
цивилизации
of the
в
civilization
биосфере
of the
и
biosphere
конфликтность
and
внутрисоциальных отношений
conflict-free
в
intrasocial
контексте.
relations in the continuity of generations.
Ключ к выходу
But
на
the key
такую
to reaching
культуру
such a culture is the
нравственные
noospheric
и
religious,
религиозные,
NRAVIOUS
нравственные
ethical in their
общества,
essence,
нравственные
objective
этические
laws.
закономерности. Поскольку
Since
мы
we live,
живем,
protecting
защищаясь
ourselves
от
from the
природных
natural
условий
environment by
искусственных
means of an
природных
artificial
закономерностей,
habitat,
мы
we do
живем
not live on the
единственно
basis of
благодаря
foraging and
построению
hunting,
охотой,
but on the basis of
развитию
food
естественных
production.
продуктов питания, то мы
Then
нуждаемся в
we need an
хозяйстве. И с
economy,
хозяйством
and the
связаны
following group of objective
следующая
laws
группа
is connected with the
закономерностей –
economy.
экономические
Economic objective
закономерности,
laws
которые
that condition either the
связаны
sufficiency of the life of
с
society
достаток
for
жизни
certain social groups,
для тех
or
или
the
иных
impossibility of
социальных
providing
групп,
economically
на
all the needs
невозможность
of the development of society.
обеспечить все потребности развития общества. Еще одна группа
Another group of objective
закономерностей – это
laws.
управленческие
These are governorial
закономерности,
objective
которые
laws
связаны с
that
DOTU.
are directly related to the sufficiently general theory of governance.
Если говорить о
If we talk about the
практике
practice of applying the sufficiently
приложения
general theory of
достаточно общей
governance
теории
to the
управления
solution
к
of
решению
governorial
управленческих
tasks,
задач, то
then
задачи
the
в
tasks, for the
большинстве
most
своем
part, are
связаны с
connected with
одной
one group of the objective
определенной
laws,
закономерностью.
rarely with two. Only
Только
very
очень
large
большие
tasks
задачи
are connected
связаны
with
со
all
всеми
6
6
groups
группами
of these
закономерностей.
objective laws.
И вот когда мы занимаемся
And
вопросами
when we deal with the
целеполагания,
questions of setting
мы
of
должны
objectives,
знать
then we must
эти
know these objective
закономерности
laws
и видеть,
and see and foresee
предвидеть
their
их
manifestation in
проявление
life.
в жизни. Только в этом случае мы
Only in
сможем
this case
построить
will we be
вектор
able to build a vector of objectives of governance in such a way
он
that it falls into the
попадает в
acceptable to
приемлемые
us
для нас
encompassing
объемы и
processes.
процессы. И его внутренняя
And
структура
its internal structure is
была
such
такой, чтобы
that all
все
these
эти
objective
определенные
laws support
закономерности
but do not block,
поддерживали
suppress, or pervert the process of governance that we are going to organize.
Они блокировали его, не подавляли, не извращали его. Ну и
Well,
интуиция должна
intuition should tell
подсказывать,
us what objective laws to use,
возможностями пользоваться,
where to look for
где
them,
их искать,
in what scientific sources.
научных. Если их
If
нет,
they are not there,
то
then how to detect them in life,
жизни,
how to formalize them in
назвать
such a
их
way
так,
that
чтобы
they
они
can neatly fit
смогли
into the solution of our governorial
реально
task.
привлечь в решении нашей управленческой задачи. Если
If we do not do
этим не
this, then
заниматься,
it may
то
turn
тогда
out
может
that we will build a
получиться так,
defective
что
vector
мы
of
построим
objectives.
эффективный вектор целей. Вектор целей,
The vector of
как я
objectives,
уже
as I
говорил,
said,
это
is a
иерархия
hierarchy
целей.
of
На
objectives.
первом месте стоит
In the
самый
first place,
значимый,
we have the most significant.
на
In the
последнем
last place
месте
in the
в
hierarchy of
иерархии
objectives,
целей стоит
we have
то,
what we
от
can
чего
give
нам
up
нужно
first.
отказаться первым. То есть
That
иерархия
is,
вектора целей
the hierarchy of the vector of objectives of governance
обратно порядку
is the opposite of the order of
significance.
significance of objectives for us.
Могут быть
There may
процессы,
be processes
в
in
которых
which we made an
мы
error concerning the
ошиблись с
task of the
заданием
hierarchy of the
выполнения
vector of
вектора
objectives.
целей. В этом случае, если
In this case,
процесс
if the
управления
process of
происходит
governance flows in
по
such a
причине,
way
что
that
мы
we
не
cannot
можем
achieve
достичь
all the
своей
objectives
цели
due to some
в силу
reason,
каких-то причин, стечения
convergence of
обстоятельств,
circumstances, the impact
воздействия
of the external
внешних среды,
environment, our own
нашей
inability
собственной
to govern the
неспособности
processes
управлять
as it is due,
процессами должным образом, то
then,
если
if
мы
we made an
ошиблись
error
по
in the
иерархии
hierarchy of the
вектора
vector of
целей,
objectives,
то на
then at some
каком-то
stage
этапе
we will
мы
abandon objectives
откажемся
which,
от
in
той
fact,
цели,
are
которая
decisive for the whole
является
process, and
всеопределяющей
we
для
will
всего
chase after the
процесса.
little things of everyday life.
И будем гоняться за мелочами житейскими. Мы достигнем результата,
We
но
will achieve the result,
воспользоваться этим
but we will
результатом
not
мы
be
не
able to
сможем
use this
должным
result
образом
properly,
по той
for
простой
the simple
причине, что
reason
когда
that
где-то
once,
мы
somewhere,
отказались от
we abandoned something decisive.
чего-то определяющего. Пример того,
An
как
example
это
of how this
происходит,
happens
это
is in the economy.
в экономике. Были проведены
Studies have been
исследования,
conducted
согласно
according
которым
to
для
which,
большинства
for the majority of
американских
American
компаний на
companies,
первом месте
profit
в
is in the
векторе
first
целей
place in the
управления
vector of objectives of
находится
governance.
прибыль. Когда анализировали
When they analyzed the
того же
activities of
опросом
Japanese
владельцев
companies
японских
using the same
автомобилей,
questionnaire,
что у них
it turned
прибыль
out that for
стоит
them,
на
profit is
третьем
in the third
месте в
place
конце
from the end of a
такого
rather extensive list.
а на первом
And
месте
in the
в
first
списке
place of this most
самых
extensive
важных
list
это
is the market
стоит
share
доля
that the
рынка,
company
которую
governs.
контролирует фирма. Вот если соотноситься с
Now,
вопросами
if we relate to the
целеполагания,
questions of setting
то
of objectives,
американцы
then
при
the
таком
Americans
построении
are
вектора
mistaken with
целей
such a
управления
construction
фирмы
of the
ошибаются.
vector of the company's objectives of
Почему?
governance.
Потому что если у вас на
Why?
первом месте управления
Because
фирмой
if your
стоит
first
доля
place
рынка,
in governing
которую
a
вы
company
контролируете,
is the market share that you govern,
и
and an increase in the
хорошей
market share
тенденцией
is considered a good
считается
tendency,
увеличение
then
доли
you,
рынка,
governing the company,
вы,
must build a long-term
управляя фирмой,
strategy,
должны построить долговременную стратегию. В
and,
этой
in this
стратегии
strategy,
предусмотреть
ensure the updating of
обновление
the products
продукции,
that you
которую вы
produce,
производите,
the
обновление
updating of the
технологий
technologies
для
and organization
организации,
on
в
which you
которой
produce
вы
products,
производите продукцию, и обновление
and updating the
продукции
products and
наличной
technologies of the
организации
organization
требует
requires
инвестиций.
investment.
И, соответственно,
Accordingly,
те
the
доходы,
profit that you
которыми
currently
вы
have, you
располагаете
must
на
govern in such a
следующий
way
год,
that in the future it will become investments in the implementation of the strategy and increase in market share. If you govern a company, optimizing governance for the maximum current profit, then, at a certain stage, you will no longer distinguish between investments in the future and costs that are subject to reduction. And as soon as you begin to reduce investments in the future, then by doing so, you, increasing the current profit, will make a significant contribution to the fact that your company will not compete with others. If the economic system is more or less homogeneous and everyone is chasing current profits, everyone will degrade. Everyone will lose to external competitors. If external competitors are fighting not for current profits, but for market share. Because if they maintain their market share and increase market share, then their current profit will be obtained automatically, immediately after the process of governance enters into a stable mode. So the starting mode, it can be really cruel for them, because they have to save on everything, investing in the future. But after the process enters into a stable mode, it will be automatically reproduced. It will only be necessary to make sure that the strategy for governing the company, maintaining and increasing the market share, is relevant all the time. But this is already a task of a different kind. But these tasks are also conditioned by the hierarchy of the vector of objectives of governance. What else may there be? There may be such a thing that if we turn to the vector of current state, then it has a governing impact, and there are free parameters. Free parameters are those parameters, any values of which we recognize as acceptable in the process of governance. But if we are in a maneuver mode, then our vector of objectives of governance is a certain function of time. Because a maneuver presupposes the achievement of final objectives through a certain sequence of intermediate objectives. Situations may arise when parameters that were previously free must be limited. And the limiting of them, or the bringing of them into a certain range, is also a task of governance. That is, the composition of the vector of objectives of governance can change. Well, now when all sorts of anti-lock braking systems, torque distribution systems, have entered into the vehicle control system, some of the parameters that are free during the straight line movement of the car become governable as soon as the car makes a turn, or finds itself on a road with some tricky covering, or from the straight line movement goes into braking, acceleration mode, and even more so if the braking and acceleration modes are carried out when making turns. This kind of thing must also be taken into account, because the unchangingness of the vector of objectives in the process of governance can be illusory, and an increase in the quality of governance, or even the possibility of achieving the final objectives of governance towards a particular process, may be conditioned by the fact that the composition and hierarchy of the vector of objectives in the process of governance will change. Now, if we again return to this picture, then we must understand that the process of governance flows in the matrix of possibilities, and this flow of events, this is the deviation of the vector of current state from the point F to the point of the third stage. And, accordingly, you can set the final objectives correctly. But, having correctly set the final objectives, you should not be mistaken in the ways and means of achieving these objectives. Therefore, the task of setting of objectives cannot be isolated from the task of solution of the stability in terms of predictability of behavior of the object. And the predictability of the behavior of objects also presupposes the knowledge of ways to achieve objectives in the matrix of possible states and transitions from one state to the other. Because if somewhere you have disruptions in your paths, then you will not be able to achieve even a correctly set objective. What else could there be in the vector of objectives? In the vector of objectives, by force of different errors, the same objectives can be duplicated on different priorities. And this can lead to conflicts of governance, to disruptions of governance. Governance can be internally conflicting. Because if you find yourself in such a situation that one and the same objective in your vector of objectives is at different priorities, then if you cannot achieve all objectives, then, abandoning this objective, a certain objective with its low priority, you will continue to work for it at higher priorities, because it enters into the vector of objectives at higher priorities. Where does this lead? Well, in the worst case, this leads to a waste of resources by strength of the fact that you will not notice the erroneousness of duplication of objectives. But if this does happen, then you need to decide what priorities this objective actually has for you. Moreover, such things may not always appear in an explicit form, since the objectives can be connected through objective laws. And by abandoning one objective, you can destroy other objectives through interconnections with the objective laws. This is also not the easiest thing, but this possibility must concretely be taken into account in practice. Internal conflictedness of objectives can be expressed not only in the fact that you violate the priorities and the same objective turns out to be at different priorities. The internal conflictedness of the vector of objectives can also be expressed in the fact that illusory objectives or mutually exclusive objectives fall into it. Well, an example of mutually exclusive objectives is the well-known saying, "The wolves are fed and the sheep are safe." The default may remain that this result is achieved as a result of the fact that the wolves eat the shepherd, and nothing was said about the shepherd in the task. But there are variants when you have an erroneous plurality of objectives at the same priority. Moreover, there may be illusory objectives among them, or mutually incompatible objectives that are at the same priority, which form such an illusory objective. Well, here is a simple example. Let's say you are on a boat. The river turns you, and you see a landscape that attracts you as a potential picnic place. You move there, and you find that part of this landscape is on one side of the river, part of the landscape is on the other side of the river, and the coveted picnic place is a combination of landscape fragments on the different banks of the river. It simply does not exist. Therefore, the questions of setting of objectives and errors in setting of objectives are very important stages in the organization of any process of governance. If you are mistaken in this, you will never be able to achieve the desired by you quality of governance, either at all, or you will lead the process to collapse, or the decrease in the quality of governance will simply cause some discomfort. But the questions of setting of objectives are the most important questions of the organization of any process of governance. If we turn to the sphere of technology and technical activity, that is, to the solution of engineering design tasks, then the questions of setting of objectives are the stage of putting forward requirements for new products. How are requirements usually put forward? Well, the question is open in every office in its own way. Well, in those situations when the market conditions dictate everything, then in a number of cases, the requirements are determined by marketers. Marketers can make errors in technical questions, and as a result, there are objects of technology that, in fact, no one needs, or being in conditions of factual operation, they turn out to be incapable of solving the tasks that were entrusted to them. This is especially bad if the creators of military equipment are mistaken. Because if we turn to our historical past, then the Russo-Japanese War, its naval battles were not lost in the seas. The naval battles of the Russo-Japanese War were not even lost at the drawing board. The naval battles of the Russo-Japanese War were lost at the stage of setting the tactical and technical requirements for the ships of the Russian Imperial Navy. Well, one of the striking examples is the cruiser Aurora. In those days, cruisers were entrusted with the task of intercepting enemy merchant ships in order to destroy the economy of the enemy. This was the main task. Participation with battleships in linear combat, this was an auxiliary task. Let's take a look at the Aurora from these positions. The speed was set insufficiently in order for the ship to get away from or catch up with other cruisers of a potential enemy. The artillery power was considered excessive in order to sink a merchant steamer or sailing ship of that era. But if there is artillery power, then the question of how to use it arises. That artillery power, in principle, could be used in squadron combat, supporting with their actions the armored forces, that is, squadron battleships. But the cruiser was completely devoid of armor, with the exception of the armored deck, which covered the mechanisms. And, as a result, it turned out that the ship carried excessive artillery power, which could not be used with the comparable in power artillery of the enemy in battle, simply because, if the enemy was protected by armor, he could withstand this battle, and the Aurora, no. Well, this is most vividly expressed in the battle at Chemulpo, when, within 45 minutes, the cruiser Variag lost almost all the artillery, and the guns, unprotected by armor, on the upper deck, and the personnel who served them. In fact, all that was disabled, although the cruiser did not receive a single serious damage that threatened its life. This is an example of how incorrectly set objectives made it impossible to achieve the objectives connected with them. Still, you see, a warship should have been created for war. And for this, the character of the war should have been guessed. Those who, at the main naval headquarters, at the Naval Technical Committee, were engaged in the working out of requirements for the ships that took part in the Russo-Japanese War. They were divorced from life. They fell into illusions. They were subject to inertia of thinking, and, as a result, into new steel-armored steamships. In a number of cases, they introduced technical solutions from the times of the sailing fleet, although the tactical situation, the possibility of forming a tactical situation, had changed dramatically since the time of the brig Mercury. Well, at this point, we can finish that which concerns setting of objectives. This is a very important stage, and the questions of setting of objectives, I emphasize once again, are inextricably linked with the solution of the task of the stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance as such. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.